What can you see here? Is it a couple or dolphins? It depends on where you're coming from, how you see the world, if you like. Children see dolphins because their experience of the world doesn't usually involve the kind of intimacy that you might have seen. Heroes talked about taking a careful look at how we see the world and the impact that has on us as leaders. Carl Jung said that certainly until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. It does seem to bubble up anyway under pressure. He also said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it's embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Do you know where and what your shadows are? Does it even matter? Jung thought it did. But what do you think? Now, does personality really matter then? Well, we could debate that all week. But we do need to understand the differences. Why? So that we can recognise how our behaviour affects working with others and working as a member of a team. Effective communication definitely underpins success at every level. Nobody would argue with that. And we need to make sure that we flex for best fit. But our shadow side can negatively affect our ability to work with others. Our over-competitiveness, our paranoia, our need to control. And it's important as well that we consider the personality traits of other people. And we can read those from their language and from their behavioural cues. Because behaviour affects communication and values affect behaviour. Now, values can be influenced, which for us on FLP is important. There are those that will say, oh no, you can't do anything about those. But we know there's evidence from crew resource management, training pilots to improve their attitudes, training police to improve, first of all, their behaviour when it comes to challenging their racist behaviour. And that can have a huge influence in turn on their values. So it's worth considering where we might influence behaviour first and then have an impact on the much more important values and what really matters to people. So IQ, which I'm sure you are all familiar with, and personality, which is different, and emotional intelligence that you read about before you joined us, we can see these as interlocking circles. Now, the theory is that personality and IQ are pretty fixed from being about 14, but EQ, emotional intelligence, is definitely developable. Now, if we think about personality first, there are a load of personality assessments around. And we use the Hexaco one, which is a development on the Big Five, which is probably the most widely used tool globally. Myers-Briggs, that I know some of you have done, fell slightly into disrepute as it wasn't designed by people with a psychology background and hasn't been validated. Some of you have been involved in Berkman methods, which uses colours, and Faro-B, which is more dated now. Not so many people use that. And it's interesting that the Americans have linked personality testing with surgical residents' performance. But also it's interesting that aspects of personality reinforced by trainers aren't necessarily the same. Things that I think are really important may be different from what you think is really important. Agreeableness, and that's the one valuing harmony, correlates well, but of course that's very highly valued by trainers. So what about this surgical personality that so many people talk about? Interestingly, from my work with different surgical specialties, there's more of a variation within specialty than between specialties. And interestingly, asking female medical students about surgeons, 40% of them talked about macho personalities. Interestingly also, 22% of medical students were put off by the perception of the old boys club. Do you think we do encourage PLUs, people like us, to join our gang? That's probably pretty much human nature, but we probably need to challenge that. There has been a shift over the last decade and a widespread recognition that ego-driven behaviours and disruptive attitudes are bad for surgical culture and bad for patients. But we shouldn't forget that Bramall wasn't on his own in theatres when he cauterised his initials into patients' livers. But no one stopped him. It wasn't until years later that he was held accountable. Do you think it's safe to say that the typical surgeon today has an appropriate degree of confidence and self-assurance with a healthy smattering of humility? That's an interesting one. What do you think? Who's this? Yep, that's right, it's Narcissus. Narcissists demonstrate arrogant, self-promoting and aggressive attitudes. And surgery has more than its fair share of narcissists and psychopaths and Machiavellians. Kevin Dutton did a study of psychopathy associated with different professions, and he identified surgeons as 5th on his list. All of those traits I mentioned, narcissism, psychopathy and Machiavellianism, are associated with callous, manipulative interpersonal styles. Other studies show that surgeons, and worryingly, paediatricians score higher on the psychopathy screening tools than those in other specialties. It does make you think, doesn't it? How self-aware are you? Remember that those who lack insight claim they have plenty. This might help us, this Johari window. Going back, work we did with T&O surgeons around the world demonstrated that there really was no typical surgical personality, no matter what tool we used. What did seem to matter, though, was how well they knew themselves. Now, if we think about ourselves, where can you get feedback on your performance, both as a leader and as a surgeon? Looking at how you will make this blind window smaller, so things that are not known to yourself but known to others. So let's use this window. Joseph and Harrington, psychologists in 1955, that's why it's called the Johari window. I always like that. They created these windows into what makes you tick. So how can we use it to improve our self-awareness as an individual and as a leader? Well, each of these windows actually is different sizes depending on how well you know yourself. In here, this is the I know, you know, there are no secrets. There's the facade window, sometimes called that, the stuff that's kept under wraps, often because we don't want to be criticised. But sharing that can really inspire us to be authentic. What was once hidden in that area, but you now talk about, might be very powerful. For instance, the imposter phenomenon, and we're going to talk about that later. And then there's the blind spot, and that could be positive or negative. And we need to use this to figure out what we don't know. But you can only do that if you're open to feedback. More about that later. But have a think. Have you ever realised something about yourself that has helped you be a better surgeon, a better team player, a better person? And then this unknown. So, for instance, if you haven't had sushi, you don't know whether you like it or not. And maybe that can inspire us to pull out of our comfort zone a bit and try new things. Now, going back to those personality assessments, and we've used Hexaco on this programme. Before 1980, the link between personality and performance was pretty tenuous, but it seems that some personality traits do help predict performance. The main point to remember, though, is that whatever tool you use, it's a conversational, not a diagnostic tool. So rather than looking at these as fixed descriptors, try to consider them as spectra. Not bad, but extremes might serve as either strengths or weaknesses, or even both. So if we start with this openness to experience, the spectrum there can go from preserver to explorer. So if you're really open to experience, you like nothing more than discussing ideas, whereas preservers are much more concrete and practical, less keen to try things out. Now, this is interesting because lots of you have said, oh no, I scored really low on that. Oh dear, I'm going to have to do better. Well, in surgery, it could be argued that being really open to things and trying new fads and ideas is not really terribly safe. And there's some merit in being a preserver and having to have amazingly brilliant concrete evidence to change anything. So don't assume that you're not good and you need to change if you scored low on openness to experience. What about conscientiousness? So that goes from being really flexible to very, very focused. So if you're high on conscientiousness, you tend to be hardworking and dutiful, and that's a good predictor of long-term life success, especially in academic attainment, where that's second only to IQ. But where might that really get in the way? It might get in the way of trying new things, of being spontaneous, of resetting priorities constantly. Worth thinking about the downside of that. And then over to introvert to extrovert. Again, there's an assumption that extroversion is great and they're life and soul of the party, and introverts not so great. But you could argue that extroverts are constantly on transmit, and as my dad often says to me, we've 2 ears and 1 mouth, and it's best to use them in those proportions. So extroverts can be on transmit rather than receive. Introverts will tend to be much more reflective and to think about things before making a contribution. And they find being with groups pretty tiring and need time to recover. Interestingly, about 2/3 of us are somewhere in the middle, so we can shift between different behaviours associated with extrovert and introvert. And there are some amazing examples of introverts who have been incredibly successful leaders. For example, Barack Obama. More about him later. And then what about this one here, agreeableness? This ranges, if you've scored low, tend to be quite a challenger, and scoring high tends to adapt to the needs of others. The opposite of agreeable is competitive rather than disagreeable. So if you're low in disagreeableness, you tend to be fairly tough and straightforward and competitive and going all out for victory. Whereas the agreeable really value harmony, tend to be very warm, and there's a chance they can be taken advantage of. And then there's this really interesting one, emotionality. That one used to be called neuroticism, and it's been renamed, which is probably sensible. And that ranges from scoring low, resilient, to high, tends to be reactive. Now, shyness is less about introversion and more about emotionality. Those who score high on emotionality tend to feel much more anxiety and emotional pain per unit of uncertainty and stress than people with low scores. And then finally, this honesty, humility trait. This is a new one that's been added, and it's the opposite of that dark triad. Now, this factor was only described in 2000 and underlies approaches towards money, power, and sex. So you can see that these are groups of traits, not types of people, and they were discovered, not invented. Now let's go back to a phenomenon we mentioned earlier. Some of you will have heard about the imposter syndrome, and current discussions around this area refer more to the imposter experience or phenomenon rather than the imposter syndrome, because syndrome makes it sound as though there's something wrong. And almost all of us will experience this at some point or points in our career. And we'll find ourselves saying, oh, I'm only a page ahead of everyone else, or I feel at any moment I'm going to get found out for the fraud I know I am. There is more of a belief now that the imposter phenomenon is normal. It's just part of your evolution as a professional. But it is worth taking a look at those around you, particularly those you admire, because they probably experience it too. That's how I found out. I was talking to a group of cardiothoracic surgeons learning how to be trainers, and they were doing micro teachings, and one of them went, oh God, I can't do this. I can't do this. I know everyone's going to find out that I'm just a fraud. I can't do it. And as I was about to launch into something supportive, when every single one of the 12 said, oh, I have that too. That's when I discovered imposter syndrome, as it was called then, or it was called Achilles syndrome then, actually. But it's been really useful for me and the people I've worked with. So it's worth asking for feedback from people who will give you a reasonably dispassionate view. They'll probably tell you you're not perfect, but that you deserve the success you've earned. And it's worth saving up that positive feedback so that you can use it when you need it, like little restorative nuggets to be excavated when you need it. It's also worth remembering that real imposters who serendipitously find themselves in positions of influence always lack the humility and the insight to work reflexively on their own practice. And they won't seek proper feedback and take a proper look in the leadership mirror. Now, I want to talk a little bit about transactional analysis, because we're going to keep on coming back to this, and another concept that I've used a huge amount over the last decade. Now, this guy, Eric Byrne, introduces transactional analysis as a way of interpreting social interactions. And he defined 3 roles or ego states that we tend to shift between: parent, child, and adult. Your parent ego state, based on your experiences of parenting or authority figures, and that ranges from controlling and ordering around to nurturing and over nurturing and taking difficult things away from your child to have to deal with. So you can see those different aspects of being a parent. Children, or the child state, where the person thinks or feels and behaves as they did in childhood, and they might be compliant and giving in and subservient, right the way to rebellious, non-compliant childlike states. And then the third one is the adults. The adults think, feel and behave based on the here and now and draw on the full range of experiences with respect and awareness and assertiveness. And the goal really is to strengthen the adult states, as the others have got limited awareness. So not always being the adult, but just being very aware of which ego state we're coming at situations and relationships with. Byrne theorizes that lots of negative behaviors can be traced back to crossing or confusing these roles, And it is worth thinking about this when we're working on improving communication, improving teamwork, and improving leadership. If we can learn to recognise and differentiate between straight and cross transactions, we'll do better. So, for example, a leader who takes the role of controlling parent will often get a childlike response. So, often very obedient, or tantrums, or not doing as they're told, other childlike responses. So we have to ask ourselves when dealing with people, are we dealing with a parent who is critical or nurturing? Are we dealing with a child who is rebellious and free or compliant? If both parties in a one-to-one conversation remain in an adult-to-adult ego state, it's unlikely that a game's being played, because such games are necessary and desirable even, but we need to be more aware of the strategies we employ every day. Because when these games operate at an unthinking level, they can be harmful to others. Now, working on the back of Burns' work, Carla, 1975, identified 5 common drivers that motivate us and that can be at the root of dysfunctional behaviours. Number 1, the driver to be perfect. Lots of you all recognise that. Number 2, the driver to be strong and maintain a stiff upper lip at all times. Number 3, the driver to hurry up, walking and talking fast, frustrated with anybody who's slowing us down. Number 4, the drive to please others, even to the detriment of ourselves. And number 5, to try hard, even if there's no impact, to keep on desperately trying. And I often remind myself that I don't have to finish a book. If I'm not enjoying it, I don't have to finish it. But my try harder driver drives that. So you can see here, Carla worked for one of the US presidents, and he said that this kind of behaviour is established from childhood, and it can serve us well. Certainly if I look to my hurry up and my try hard and my be perfect drivers, they can work really to help me achieve what I need to, but they can also be really destructive. So here on FLP, we're going to develop the potential of the positive aspects of our drivers and learn how to respond constructively to the negative. The other interesting way of looking at things is with givers, takers and matchers. And you can see here on these quadrants, so they're all over the place, aren't they? But the self-interest dimension here and the caring for others dimension. And we can see here those that are hugely self-interested and not interested in others are takers. There are the selfless givers here who put others before themselves and their own interests. And then there's these other ones here, the successful givers, who make sure their own self-interests are met, but also high on others' interest as well. Now, most people assume that self-interest and concern for others are opposite, but they aren't. They run parallel. And actually, as we've said here, it's better to keep an eye on your own self-interest as we care for others. So we've got givers, we've got takers, and we've got matchers. And there are givers. If we look at success and successful leaders, we've got givers right at the top and at the bottom of the pile. Interestingly, matchers, those that will only give if they're going to get back, are the demise of takers because they hate people taking advantage. And I've been in thinking about Salk, the guy who developed the polio vaccine, and he took all the credit for that. Interestingly, he never had another success afterwards because there was no acknowledgement for others. He only saw himself. So we're going to think about those givers, takers and matchers. Now, what about the generation gap? Each generation is defined by its demographics and shaped by a common history, influenced by common events, if you like. So it may be that for you, it's 9/11 and smartphones. And because of similar experiences and exposure to culture as a child, Individuals within any generation share similar behaviour and have comparable values. Now, what is interesting is that by the end of your career, you're going to be working with those not just one generation down, but two. So if you're from the millennial generation, which is different from Heroes and mine, born after 1980 and before 1999, what would you say about yourself as a generation? Others say about you that you're educated and skilled and comfortable with technology and comparatively very self-confident. You score higher on intelligence tests, although you are less likely to read books when compared to preceding generations. What about the dark side, though? Some say that you have more of a sense of entitlement and the world owes you and you expect good marks for trying rather than just performance. You're given better grades for less work at GCSEs and A-levels. Come to expect an easy ride, may well have more ambition than skill, and may well demand lighter work schedules. That's what's said. There's also these interesting comments about being protected and sheltered by parents who are sometimes referred to as helicopter parents. And that kind of behaviour is suggested to perpetuate adolescence and delay development of independence. Is that right? Is that fair? I suppose the really important thing is that you see the world differently from the baby boomer generation, which is me, or Generation X, which is Hero. Baby boomers have been impacted by, my generation have been impacted by the introduction of TV, civil rights and computers. Typical characteristics have been described as competitive, optimistic, consumeristic and living to work. Generation X, Hero's generation, individuals were raised by live to work baby boomers and often raised in single parent households with the Gulf War, AIDS and mobile phones. Direct supervision and family bonding were challenged. Therefore, as a group, Generation X are considered to be more cynical, sceptical and pessimistic. They're private and likely to take care of their own needs, and they're sometimes called the me generation, being self-motivated, independent and pragmatic. So how can all of this help? What relevance does it have to you as a leader? Well, it probably depends on context. On the context, the culture and the stage of evolution of the people you're working with or leading. But what it does tell us is we need to be really careful about our bias towards PLUs. People like us. We love people like us and we like to gaggle with them. But when we work with people like us, none of our ideas are challenged. How are you going to bridge the generation gap? The generation gap to the previous generation and the generation after that and the generation after that. Remember, when it comes to personality, there is no one good profile. There are a bunch of traits. Work out how those traits are going to help and how they're going to hinder. And beware of extremes. Consider your drivers. What impact will they have? How can you maximise the upsides and minimise the dark sides? This is going to be about striving for self-awareness. So, you will have completed your Hexaco and we want you to think about those 200 words you've summarised. What impact do you think your personality will have on your leadership role?